This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 15. Sorais' Song. After our escape from Agon and his pious crew, we returned to our quarters in the palace, and had a very good time. The two queens, the nobles, and the people vied with each other in doing us honour and showering gifts upon us. As for that painful little incident of the hippopotami, it sank into oblivion, where we were quite content to leave it. Every day deputations and individuals waited on us to examine our guns and clothing, our chain shirts, and our instruments, especially our watches, with which they were much delighted. In short, we became quite the rage, so much so that some of the fashionable young swells among the Zuvendi began to copy the cut of some of our clothes, notably Sir Henry's shooting jacket. One day, indeed, a deputation waited on us, and as usual Good donned his full dress uniform for the occasion. This deputation seemed somehow to be a little different class to those who generally came to visit us. They were little insignificant men of an excessively polite, not to say servile, demeanour, and their attention appeared to be chiefly taken up with observing the details of Good's full dress uniform, of which they took copious notes and measurements. Good was much flattered at the time, not suspecting that he had to deal with the 6 leading tailors of Milosis. A fortnight afterwards, however, when, on attending court as usual, he had the pleasure of seeing some 7 or 8 Zuvendi mashers arrayed in all the glory of a very fair imitation of his full dress uniform, he changed his mind. I shall never forget his face of astonishment and disgust. It was after this, chiefly to avoid remark, and also because our clothes were wearing out and had to be saved up, that we resolved to adopt the native dress, and a very comfortable one we found it, though I am bound to say that I looked sufficiently ridiculous in it, and as for Alphonse, only Umslopogaas would have none of these things. When his moocha was worn out, the fierce old Zulu made him a new one, and went about unconcerned, as grim and naked as his own battle-axe. Meanwhile, we pursued our study of the language steadily and made very good progress. On the morning following our adventure in the temple, 3 grave and reverend signors presented themselves armed with manuscript books, inkhorns, and feather pens, and indicated that they had been sent to teach us. So, with the exception of Umslopogaas, we all buckled to with a will, doing 4 hours a day. As for Umslopogaas, he would have none of that either. He did not wish to learn that women's talk, not he, and when one of the teachers advanced on him with a book and an inkhorn and waved them before him in a mild persuasive way, much as a churchwarden invitingly shakes the offertory bag under the nose of a rich but niggardly parishioner, he sprang up with a fierce oath and flashed Inkosi-kaas before the eyes of our learned friend, and there was an end of the attempt to teach him Zuvendi. Thus we spent our mornings in useful occupation, which grew more and more interesting as we proceeded, and the afternoons were given up to recreation. Sometimes we made trips, notably one to the gold mines, and another to the marble quarries, both of which I wished I had space and time to describe. And sometimes we went out hunting buck with dogs trained for that purpose, and a very exciting sport it is, as the country is full of agricultural enclosures and our horses were magnificent. This is not to be wondered at, seeing that the royal stables were at our command, in addition to which we had 4 splendid saddle horses given to us by Nyleptha. Sometimes, again, we went hawking, a pastime that is in great favour among the Zuvendi, who generally fly their birds at a species of partridge which is remarkable for the swiftness and strength of its flight. When attacked by the hawk, this bird appears to lose its head, and instead of seeking cover, flies high into the sky, thus offering wonderful sport. I have seen one of these partridges soar up almost out of sight when followed by the hawk. Still better sport is offered by a variety of solitary snipe as big as a small woodcock, which is plentiful in this country, and which is flown at with a very small, agile, and highly trained hawk with an almost red tail. The zigzagging of the great snipe and the lightning rapidity of the flight and movements of the red-tailed hawk make the pastime a delightful one. Another variety of the same amusement is the hunting of a very small species of antelope with trained eagles, and it certainly is a marvellous sight to see the great bird soar and soar till he is nothing but a black speck in the sunlight, and then suddenly come dashing down like a cannonball upon some cowering buck that is hidden in a patch of grass from everything but that piercing eye. Still finer is the spectacle when the eagle takes the buck running. On other days we would pay visits to the country seats at some of the great lords' beautiful fortified places, and the villages clustering beneath their walls. Here we saw vineyards and cornfields and well-kept park-like grounds, with such timber in them as filled me with delight, for I do love a good tree. There it stands, so strong and sturdy, and yet so beautiful, a very type of the best sort of man. How proudly it lifts its bare head to the winter storms, and with what a full heart it rejoices when the spring has come again. How grand its voice is, too, when it talks with the wind. 1,000 Aeolian harps cannot equal the beauty of the sighing of a great tree in leaf. All day it points to the sunshine, and all night to the stars, and thus passionless and yet full of life it endures through the centuries, come storm, come shine, drawing its sustenance from the cool bosom of its mother earth, and as the slow years roll by, learning the great mysteries of growth and of decay, and so on and on through generations, outliving individuals, customs, dynasties, all save the landscape it adorns, and human nature, till the appointed day when the wind wins the long battle and rejoices over a reclaimed space, or decay puts the last stroke to his fungus-fingered work. Ah, one should always think twice before one cuts down a tree. In the evenings it was customary for Sir Henry, Good, and myself to dine, or rather sup, with their Majesties. Not every night, indeed, but about 3 or 4 times a week, whenever they had not much company, or the affairs of state would allow of it. And I am bound to say that those little suppers were quite the most charming things of their sort that I ever had to do with. How true is the saying that the very highest in rank are always the most simple and kindly. It is from your half and half sort of people that you get pomposity and vulgarity, the difference between the two being very much what one sees every day in England between the old out-at-elbows broken-down country family and the overbearing, purse-proud people who come and take the place. I really think that Nyleptha's greatest charm is her sweet simplicity and her kindly, genuine interest even in little things. She is the simplest woman I ever knew, and where her passions are not involved, one of the sweetest. But she can look queenly enough when she likes, and be as fierce as any savage too. For instance, never shall I forget that scene when I for the first time was sure that she was really in love with Curtis. It came about in this way, all through Good's weakness for ladies' society. When we had been employed for some 3 months in learning Zuvendi, it struck Master Good that he was getting rather tired of the old gentleman who did us the honour to lead us in the way that we should go, so he proceeded, without saying a word to anybody else, to inform them that it was a peculiar fact, but that we could not make any real progress in the deeper intricacies of a foreign language unless we were taught by ladies, young ladies, he was careful to explain. In his own country, he pointed out, it was habitual to choose the very best-looking and most charming girls who could be found to instruct any strangers who happened to come that way, etc. All of this the old gentleman swallowed open-mouthed. There was, they admitted, reason in what he said, since the contemplation of the beautiful, as their philosophy taught, induced a certain porosity of mind, similar to that produced upon the physical body by the healthful influences of sun and air. Consequently, it was probable that we might absorb the Zuvendi tongue a little faster if suitable teachers could be found. Another thing was that, as the female sex was naturally loquacious, good practice would be gained in the viva voce department of our studies. To all of this Good gravely assented, and the learned gentleman departed, assuring him that their orders were to fall in with our wishes in every way, and that, if possible, our views should be met. Imagine, therefore, the surprise and disgust of myself, and I trust and believe Sir Henry, when, on entering the room where we were accustomed to carry on our studies the following morning, we found, instead of our usual venerable tutors, 3 of the best-looking young women whom Milosis could produce, and that is saying a good deal, who blushed and smiled and curtsied, and gave us to understand that they were there to carry on our instruction. Then Good, as we gazed at one another in bewilderment, thought fit to explain, saying that it had slipped his memory before, but the old gentleman had told him on the previous evening that it was absolutely necessary that our further education should be carried on by the other sex. I was overwhelmed, and appealed to Sir Henry for advice in such a crisis. "Well," he said, "you see the ladies are here, ain't they? If we sent them away, don't you think it might hurt their feelings, eh? One doesn't like to be rough, you see, and they look regular blues, don't they, eh?" By this time Good had already begun his lessons with the handsomest of the 3, and so with a sigh I yielded. That day everything went very well. The young ladies were certainly very clever, and they only smiled when we blundered. I never saw Good so attentive to his books before, and even Sir Henry appeared to tackle Zuvendi with a renewed zest. Ah, thought I, will it always be thus? Next day we were much more lively. Our work was pleasingly interspersed with questions about our native country, what the ladies were like there, etc., all of which we answered as best we could in Zuvendi, and I heard Good assuring his teacher that her loveliness was to the beauties of Europe as the sun to the moon, to which she replied with a little toss of the head that she was a plain teaching woman and nothing else, and that it was not kind to deceive a poor girl so. Then we had a little singing that was really charming, so natural and unaffected. The Zuvendi love songs are most touching. On the third day we were all quite intimate. Good narrated some of his previous love affairs to his fair teacher, and so moved was she that her sighs mingled with his own. I discoursed with mine, a merry blue-eyed girl, upon Zuvendian art, and never saw that she was waiting for an opportunity to drop a specimen of the cockroach tribe down my back, whilst in the corner Sir Henry and his governess appeared, so far as I could judge, to be going through a lesson framed on the great educational principles laid down by Wackford Squeers, Esquire, though in a very modified, or rather spiritualized form. The lady softly repeated the Zuvendi word for hand, and he took hers. Eyes, and he gazed deep into her brown orbs. Lips, but just at that moment my young lady dropped the cockroach down my back and ran away laughing. Now, if there is one thing I loathe more than another, it is cockroaches, and moved quite beyond myself, and yet laughing at her impudence, I took up the cushion she had been sitting on and threw it after her. Imagine then my shame, my horror, and my distress when the door opened, and, attended by 2 guards only, in walked Nyleptha. The cushion could not be recalled. It missed the girl and hit one of the guards on the head. But I instantly and ineffectually tried to look as though I had not thrown it. Good ceased his singing and began to murder Zuvendi at the top of his voice, and Sir Henry whistled and looked silly. As for the poor girls, they were utterly dumbfounded. And Nyleptha! She drew herself up till her frame seemed to tower even above that of the tall guards, and her face went first red and then pale as death. "Guards," she said in a quiet, choked voice, and pointing at the fair but unconscious disciple of Wackford Squeers, "slay me that woman." The men hesitated, as well they might. "Will ye do my bidding," she said again in the same voice, "or will ye not?" Then they advanced upon the girl with uplifted spears. By this time Sir Henry had recovered himself, and saw that the comedy was likely to turn into a tragedy. "Stand back," he said in a voice of thunder, at the same time getting in front of the terrified girl. "Shame on thee, Nyleptha, shame! Thou shalt not kill her." "Doubtless thou hast good reason to try to protect her. Thou couldst hardly do less in honour," answered the infuriated Queen. "But she shall die, she shall die," and she stamped her little foot. "It is well," he answered, "then will I die with her. I am thy servant, O Queen. Do with me even as thou wilt." And he bowed towards her, and fixed his clear eyes contemptuously on her face. "I could wish to slay thee too," she answered, "for thou dost make a mock of me." And then, feeling that she was mastered, and I suppose not knowing what else to do, she burst into such a storm of tears, and looked so royally lovely in her passionate distress, that, old as I am, I must say I envied Curtis his task of supporting her. It was rather odd to see him holding her in his arms, considering what had just passed, a thought that seemed to occur to herself, for presently she wrenched herself free and went, leaving us all much disturbed. Presently, however, one of the guards returned with a message to the girls that they were, on pain of death, to leave the city and return to their homes in the country, and that no further harm would come to them. And accordingly they went, one of them remarking philosophically that it could not be helped, and that it was a satisfaction to know that they had taught us a little serviceable Zuvendi. Mine was an exceedingly nice girl, and overlooking the cockroach, I made her a present of my favourite lucky sixpence with a hole in it when she went away. After that our former masters resumed their course of instruction, needless to say to my great relief. That night, when in fear and trembling we attended the royal supper table, we found that Nyleptha was laid up with a bad headache. That headache lasted for 3 whole days, but on the 4th she was present at supper as usual, and with the most gracious and sweet smile gave Sir Henry her hand to lead her to the table. No allusion was made to the little affair described above, beyond her saying, with a charming air of innocence, that when she came to see us at our studies the other day she had been seized with a giddiness from which she had only now recovered. She supposed, she added with a touch of the humour that was common to her, that it was the sight of people working so hard which had affected her. In reply, Sir Henry said, dryly, that he had thought she did not look quite herself on that day, whereat she flashed one of those quick glances of hers at him, which, if he had the feelings of a man, must have gone through him like a knife, and the subject dropped entirely. Indeed, after supper was over, Nyleptha condescended to put us through an examination to see what we had learnt, and to express herself well satisfied with the results. Indeed, she proceeded to give us, especially Sir Henry, a lesson on her own account, and very interesting we found it. And all the while that we talked, or rather tried to talk, and laughed, Sorais would sit there in her carven ivory chair and look at us and read us all like a book, only from time to time saying a few words, and smiling that quick ominous smile of hers, which was more like a flash of summer lightning on a dark cloud than anything else. And as near to her as he dared would sit Good, worshipping through his eyeglass, for he really was getting seriously devoted to this sombre beauty, of whom, speaking personally, I felt terribly afraid. I watched her keenly, and soon I found out that for all her apparent impassibility she was at heart bitterly jealous of Nyleptha. Another thing I found out, and the discovery filled me with dismay, and that was that she also was growing devoted to Sir Henry Curtis. Of course I could not be sure. It is not easy to read so cold and haughty a woman, but I noticed one or two little things, and, as elephant hunters know, dried grass shows which way the wind has set. And so another 3 months passed over us, by which time we had all attained to a very considerable mastery of the Zuvendi language, which is an easy one to learn. And as time went on we became great favourites with the people, and even with the courtiers, gaining an enormous reputation for cleverness, because, as I think I have said, Sir Henry was able to show them how to make glass, which was a national want, and also, by the help of a 20-year almanac that we had with us, to predict various heavenly combinations, which were quite unsuspected by the native astronomers. We even succeeded in demonstrating the principle of the steam engine to a gathering of the learned men, who were filled with amazement, and several other things of the same sort we did. And so it came about that the people made up their minds that we must on no account be allowed to go out of the country, which indeed was an apparent impossibility even if we had wished it, and we were advanced to great honour and made officers to the bodyguards of the sister queens, while permanent quarters were signed to us in the palace, and our opinion was asked upon questions of national policy. But blue as the sky seemed, there was a cloud, and a big one, on the horizon. We had indeed heard no more of those confounded hippopotami, but it is not on that account to be supposed that our sacrilege was forgotten, or the enmity of the great and powerful priesthood headed by Agon appeased. On the contrary, it was burning the more fiercely because it was necessarily suppressed, and what had perhaps begun in bigotry was ending in downright direct hatred born of jealousy. Hitherto the priests had been the wise men of the land, and were on this account, as well as from superstitious causes, looked on with peculiar veneration. But our rival, with our outlandish wisdom and our strange inventions and hints of unimagined things, dealt a serious blow to this state of affairs, and among the educated Zuvendi went far towards destroying the priestly prestige. A still worse affront to them, however, was the favour with which we were regarded, and the trust that was reposed in us. All these things tended to make us excessively obnoxious to the great sacerdotal clan, the most powerful because the most united faction in the kingdom. Another source of imminent danger to us was the rising envy of some of the great lords, headed by Nyleptha, whose antagonism to us had at best been but thinly veiled, and which now threatened to break out into open flame. Nyleptha had for some years been a candidate for Nyleptha's hand in marriage, and when we appeared on the scene I fancy, from all I could gather, that though there were still many obstacles in his path, success was by no means out of his reach. But now all this had changed. The coy Nyleptha smiled no more in his direction, and he was not slow to guess the cause. Infuriated and alarmed, he turned his attention to Sorais, only to find that he might as well try to woo a mountainside. With a bitter jest or two about his fickleness, that door was closed on him forever. So Nyleptha bethought himself of the 30,000 wild swordsmen who would pour down at his bidding through the northern mountain passes, and no doubt vowed to adorn the gates of Milosis with our heads. But first he determined, as I learned, to make one more attempt, and to demand the hand of Nyleptha in the open court after the formal annual ceremony of the signing of the laws that had been proclaimed by the Queens during the year. Of this astounding fact Nyleptha heard with simulated nonchalance, and with a little trembling of the voice herself informed us of it as we sat at supper on the night preceding the great ceremony of the law-giving. Sir Henry bit his lip, and do what he could to prevent it plainly showed his agitation. "And what answer will the Queen be pleased to give the great lord?" asked I in a jesting manner. "Answer, Macumazahn," for we had elected to pass by our Zulu names in Zu Vendis, she said with a pretty shrug of her ivory shoulder. "Nay, I know not. What is a poor woman to do when the wooer has 30,000 swords wherewith to urge his love?" And from under her long lashes she glanced at Curtis. Just then we rose from the table to adjourn into another room. "Quatermain, a word, quick," said Sir Henry to me. "Listen, I have never spoken about it, but surely you have guessed. I love Nyleptha. What am I to do?" Fortunately I had more or less already taken the question into consideration, and was therefore able to give such answer as seemed the wisest to me. "You must speak to Nyleptha tonight," I said. "Now is your time, now or never. Listen, in the sitting chamber get near to her, and whisper to her to meet you at midnight by the Rademas statue at the end of the great hall. I will keep watch for you there. Now or never, Curtis." We passed on into the other room. Nyleptha was sitting, her hands before her, and a sad, anxious look upon her lovely face. A little way off was Sorais talking to Good in her slow, measured tones. The time went on. In another quarter of an hour I knew that, according to their habit, the Queens would retire. As yet, Sir Henry had had no chance of saying a word in private. Indeed, though we saw much of the royal sisters, it was by no means easy to see them alone. I racked my brains, and at last an idea came to me. "Will the Queen be pleased," I said, bowing low before Sorais, "to sing to her servants? Our hearts are heavy this night. Sing to us, O Lady of the Night," Sorais' favourite name among the people. "My songs, Macumazahn, are not such as to lighten the heavy heart, yet will I sing if it pleases thee," she answered. And she rose and went a few paces to a table whereon lay an instrument not unlike a zither, and struck a few wandering chords. Then suddenly, like the notes of some deep-throated bird, her rounded voice sang out in song so wildly sweet, and yet with so eerie and sad a refrain, that it made the very blood stand still. Up, up soared the golden notes, that seemed to melt far away, and then to grow again and travel on, laden with all the sorrow of the world and all the despair of the lost. It was a marvellous song, but I had not time to listen to it properly. However, I got the words of it afterwards, and here is a translation of its burden, so far as it admits of being translated at all. Sorais' Song. As a desolate bird that through darkness its lost way is winging, as a hand that is helplessly raised when death's sickle is swinging, so is life, aye, the life that lends passion and breath to my singing. As the nightingale's song that is full of a sweetness unspoken, as a spirit unbarring the gates of the skies for a token, so is love, aye, the love that shall fall when his pinion is broken. As the tramp of the legions when trumpets their challenge are sending, as the shout of the storm god when lightnings the black sky are rending, so is power, aye, the power that shall lie in the dust at its ending. So short is our life, yet with space for all things to forsake us, a bitter delusion, a dream from which naught can awake us, till death's dogging footsteps at morn or at eve shall o'ertake us. Refrain. Oh, the world is fair at the dawning, 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 but the red sun sinks in blood. The red sun sinks in blood. I only wish that I could write down the music too. "Now, Curtis, now," I whispered when she began the second verse, and turned my back. "Nyleptha," he said, for my nerves were so much on the stretch that I could hear every word, low as it was spoken, even through Sorais' divine notes. "Nyleptha, I must speak with thee this night. Upon my life, I must. Say me not nay. Oh, say me not nay." "How can I speak with thee?" she answered, looking fixedly before her. "Queens are not like other people. I am surrounded and watched." "Listen, Nyleptha, thus. I will be before the statue of Rademas in the great hall at midnight. I have the countersign and can pass in. Macumazahn will be there to keep guard, and with him the Zulu. Oh, come, my Queen, deny me not." "It is not seemly," she murmured. "And tomorrow—" Just then the music began to die in the last wail of the refrain, and Sorais slowly turned her round. "I will be there," said Nyleptha hurriedly. "On thy life, see that thou fail me not." Chapter 15. Vox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 16. Before the Statue. It was night, dead night, and the silence lay on the frowning city like a cloud. Secretly, as evildoers, Sir Henry Curtis, Umslopogaas, and myself threaded our way through the passage towards a by-entrance to the great throne chamber. Once we were met by the fierce rattling challenge of the sentry. I gave the countersign, and the man grounded his spear and let us pass. Also, we were officers of the Queen's bodyguard, and in that capacity had a right to come and go unquestioned. We gained the hall in safety. So empty and so still was it, that even when we had passed, the sound of our footsteps yet echoed up the lofty walls, vibrating faintly and still more faintly against the carven roof, like ghosts of the footsteps of dead men, haunting the place that once they trod. It was an eerie spot, and it oppressed me. The moon was full, and threw great pencils and patches of light through the high windowless openings in the walls, that lay pure and beautiful upon the blackness of the marble floor, like white flowers on a coffin. One of these silver arrows fell upon the statue of the sleeping Rademas, and of the angel form bent over him, illuminating it, and a small circle round it, with a soft clear light, reminding me of that with which Catholics illumine the altars of their cathedrals. Here by the statue we took our stand, and waited, Sir Henry and I close together, Umslopogaas some paces off in the darkness, so that I could only just make out his towering outline, leaning on the outline of an axe. So long did we wait that I almost fell asleep, resting against the cold marble, but was suddenly aroused by hearing Curtis give a quick catching breath. Then from far away there came a little sound, as though the statues that lined the walls were whispering to each other some message of the ages. It was the faint sweep of a lady's dress. Nearer it grew, and nearer yet. We could see a figure steal from patch to patch of moonlight, and even hear the soft fall of sandalled feet. Another second, and I saw the black silhouette of the old Zulu raise its arm in mute salute, and Nyleptha was before us. Oh, how beautiful she looked as she paused a moment just within the circle of the moonlight. Her hand was pressed upon her heart, and her white bosom heaved beneath it. Round her head a broidered scarf was loosely thrown, partially shadowing the perfect face, and thus rendering it even more lovely. For beauty, dependent as it is to a certain extent upon the imagination, is never so beautiful as when it is half hid. There she stood, radiant, but half doubting, stately, and yet so sweet. It was but a moment, but I then and there fell in love with her myself, and have remained so to this hour, for indeed she looked more like an angel out of heaven than a loving, passionate, mortal woman. Low we bowed before her, and then she spoke. "I have come," she whispered, "but it was at great risk. Ye know not how I am watched. The priests watch me. Sorais watches me with those great eyes of hers. My very guards are spies upon me. Nyleptha watches me too. Oh, let him be careful," and she stamped her foot. "Let him be careful. I am a woman and therefore hard to drive. Ay, and I am a queen too, and can still avenge. Let him be careful, I say, lest in place of giving him my hand I take his head," and she ended the outburst with a little sob, and then smiled up at us bewitchingly and laughed. "Thou didst bid me come hither, my lord Incubu," Curtis had taught her to call him so. "Doubtless it is about business of the state, for I know that thou art ever full of great ideas and plans for my welfare and my people's. So even as a queen should I have come, though I greatly fear the dark alone," and again she laughed and gave him a glance from her grey eyes. At this point I thought it wise to move a little, since secrets of the state should not be made public property, but she would not let me go far, peremptorily stopping me within 5 yards or so, saying that she feared surprise. So it came to pass that, however unwillingly, I heard all that passed. "Thou knowest, Nyleptha," said Sir Henry, "that it was for none of these things that I asked thee to meet me at this lonely place. Nyleptha, waste not the time in pleasantry, but listen to me, for I love thee." As he said the words I saw her face break up, as it were, and change. The coquetry went out of it, and in its place there shone a great light of love which seemed to glorify it, and make it like that of the marble angel overhead. I could not help thinking that it must have been a touch of prophetic instinct which made the long dead Rademas limn in the features of the angel of his inspiring vision so strange a likeness of his own descendant. Sir Henry also must have observed and been struck by the likeness, for catching the look upon Nyleptha's face, he glanced quickly from it to the moonlit statue, and then back again at his beloved. "Thou sayest thou dost love me," she said in a low voice, "and thy voice rings true, but how am I to know that thou dost speak the truth? Though," she went on with proud humility, and in the stately third person which is so largely used by the Zuvendi, "I be as nothing in the eyes of my lord," and she curtsied towards him, "who comes from among a wonderful people, to whom my people are but children. Yet here am I, a queen and a leader of men, and if I would go to battle 100,000 spears shall sparkle in my train like stars glimmering down the path of the bent moon. And although my beauty be a little thing in the eyes of my lord," and she lifted her broidered skirt and curtsied again, "yet here among my own people am I held right fair, and ever since I was a woman the great lords of my kingdom have made quarrel concerning me, as though forsooth she added with a flash of passion. "I were a deer to be pulled down by the hungriest wolf, or a horse to be sold to the highest bidder. Let my lord pardon me if I weary my lord, but it hath pleased my lord to say that he loves me, Nyleptha, a queen of the Zuvendi, and therefore would I say that though my love in my hand be not much to my lord, yet to me they are all." "Oh!" she cried, with a sudden and thrilling change of voice, and modifying her dignified mode of address. "Oh, how can I know that thou lovest but me? How can I know that thou wilt not weary of me, and seek thine own place again, leaving me desolate? Who is there to tell me but that thou lovest some other woman, some fair woman unknown to me, but who yet draws breath beneath this same moon that shines on me tonight? Tell me, how am I to know?" And she clasped her hands and stretched them out towards him and looked appealingly into his face. "Nyleptha," answered Sir Henry, adopting the Zuvendi way of speech, "I have told thee that I love thee. How am I to tell thee how much I love thee? Is there a measure for love? Yet will I try. I say not that I have never looked upon another woman with favour, but this I say, that I love thee with all my life and with all my strength, that I love thee now and shall love thee till I grow cold in death, ay, and as I believe beyond my death, and on for ever. I say that thy voice is music to my ear, and thy touch is water to a thirsty land, that when thou art there the world is beautiful, and when I see thee not it is as though the light was dead. O Nyleptha, I will never leave thee. Here and now for thy dear sake I will forget my people and my father's house, yea, I renounce them all. By thy side will I live, Nyleptha, and at thy side will I die." He paused and gazed at her earnestly, but she hung her head like a lily and never said a word. "Look," he went on, pointing to the statue on which the moonlight played so brightly. "Thou seest that angel woman who rests her hand upon the forehead of the sleeping man, and thou seest how at her touch his soul flames up and shines out through his flesh, even as a lamp at the touch of the fire. So it is with me and thee, Nyleptha. Thou hast awakened my soul and called it forth, and now, Nyleptha, it is not mine, but thine, and thine only. There is no more for me to say. In thy hands is my life," and he leaned back against the pedestal of the statue, looking very pale and his eyes shining, but proud and handsome as a god. Slowly, slowly she raised her head and fixed her wonderful eyes, all alight with the greatness of her passion, full upon his face, as though to read his very soul. Then at last she spoke, low indeed, but clearly as a silver bell. "Of a truth, weak woman that I am, I do believe thee. Ill will be the day for thee and for me also if it be my fate to learn that I have believed a lie. And now hearken to me, O man, who hath wandered here from far to steal my heart and make me all thine own. I put my hand upon thy hand, thus, and thus I, whose lips have never kissed before, do kiss thee on the brow, and now by my hand, and by that first and holy kiss, ay, by my people's weal and by my throne that like enough I shall lose for thee, by the name of my high house, by the sacred stone, and by the eternal majesty of the sun, I swear that for thee will I live and die, and I swear that I will love thee and thee only till death, ay, and beyond, if, as thou sayest, there be a beyond, and that thy will shall be my will, and thy ways my ways. O see, see, my lord, thou knowest not how humble is she who loves. I, who am a queen, I kneel before thee, even at thy feet I do my homage." And the lovely impassioned creature flung herself down on her knees on the cold marble before him. And after that I really do not know, for I could stand it no longer, and cleared off to refresh myself with a little of old Umslopogaas's society, leaving them to settle it their own way, and a very long time they were about it. I found the old warrior leaning on Inkosi-kaas as usual, and surveying the scene in the patch of moonlight with a grim smile of amusement. "Ah, Macumazahn," he said, "I suppose it is because I am getting old, but I don't think that I shall ever learn to understand the ways of you white people. Look there now, I pray thee, they are a pretty pair of doves, but what is all the fuss about, Macumazahn? He wants a wife, and she wants a husband. Then why does he not pay his cows down?" End note. Alluding to the Zulu custom. Allan Quatermain. Like a man, and have done with it. It would save a deal of trouble, and we should have had our night's sleep. But there they go, talk, 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 and kiss, 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 like mad things. Ugh! Some 3/4 of an hour afterwards, the pair of doves came strolling towards us, Curtis looking slightly silly, and Nyleptha remarking calmly that the moonlight made very pretty effects on the marble. Then, for she was in a most gracious mood, she took my hand and said that I was her lord's dear friend, and therefore most dear to her, not a word for my own sake, you see. Next she lifted Umslopogaas's axe and examined it curiously, saying significantly as she did so that he might soon have cause to use it in defence of her. After that she nodded prettily to us all, and casting a tender glance at her lover, glided off into the darkness like a beautiful vision. When we got back to our quarters, which we did without accident, Curtis asked me jocularly what I was thinking about. "I am wondering," I answered, "on what principle it is arranged that some people should find beautiful queens to fall in love with them, while others find nobody at all, or worse than nobody. And I am also wondering how many brave men's lives this night's work will cost." It was rather nasty of me, perhaps, but somehow all the feelings do not evaporate with age, and I could not help being a little jealous of my old friend's luck. Vanity, my sons, vanity of vanities. On the following morning Good was informed of the happy occurrence, and positively rippled with smiles that, originating somewhere about the mouth, slowly travelled up his face like the rings in a duck pond, till they flowed over the brim of his eyeglass and went where sweet smiles go. The fact of the matter, however, was that not only was Good rejoiced about the thing on its own merits, but also for personal reasons. He adored Sorais quite as earnestly as Sir Henry adored Nyleptha, and his adoration had not altogether prospered. Indeed, it had seemed to him, and to me also, that the dark Cleopatra-like queen favoured Curtis in her own curious inscrutable way much more than Good. Therefore it was a relief to him to learn that his unconscious rival was permanently and satisfactorily attached in another direction. His face fell a little, however, when he was told that the whole thing was to be kept as secret as the dead, above all from Sorais for the present, inasmuch as the political convulsion which would follow such an announcement at the moment would be altogether too great to face, and would very possibly, if prematurely made, shake Nyleptha from her throne. That morning we again attended in the throne hall, and I could not help smiling to myself when I compared the visit to our last, and reflecting that, if walls could speak, they would have strange tales to tell. What actresses women are! There, high upon her golden throne, draped in her blazoned kaf or robe of state, sat the fair Nyleptha, and when Sir Henry came in a little late, dressed in the full uniform of an officer of her guard, and humbly bent himself before her, she merely acknowledged his salute with a careless nod, and turned her head coldly aside. It was a very large court, for not only did the signing of the laws attract many outside of those whose duty it was to attend, but also the rumour that Nasta was going to publicly ask the hand of Nyleptha in marriage had gone abroad, with the result that the great hall was crowded to its utmost capacity. There were our friends the priests in force, headed by Agon, who regarded us with a vindictive eye, and the most imposing band they were, with their long white embroidered robes girt with a golden chain from which hung the fish-like scales. There too were a number of the lords, each with a band of brilliantly attired attendants, and prominent among them was Nasta, stroking his black beard meditatively and looking unusually pleasant. It was a splendid and impressive sight, especially when the officer, after having read out each law, handed them to the Queens to sign, whereon the trumpets blared out and the Queen's guard grounded their spears with a crash in salute. This reading and signing of the laws took a long time, but at length it came to an end, the last one reciting that whereas distinguished strangers, etc., and proceeding to confer on the three of us the rank of lords, together with certain military commands and large estates bestowed by the Queen. When it was read, the trumpets blared and the spears clashed down as usual, but I saw some of the lords turn and whisper to each other, while Nasta ground his teeth. They did not like the favour that was shown to us, which, under all the circumstances, was not perhaps unnatural. Then there came a pause, and Nasta stepped forward, and bowing humbly, though with no humility in his eye, craved a boon at the hands of the Queen Nyleptha. Nyleptha turned a little pale, but bowed graciously, and prayed the well-beloved lord to speak on, whereon in a few straightforward soldier-like words he asked her hand in marriage. Then, before she could find words to answer, the High Priest Agon took up the tale, and in a speech of real eloquence and power pointed out the many advantages of the proposed alliance, how it would consolidate the kingdom, for Nasta's dominions, of which he was virtually king, were to Zuvendi much what Scotland used to be to England, how it would gratify the wild mountaineers and be popular among the soldiery, for Nasta was a famous general, how it would set her dynasty firmly on the throne, and would gain the blessing and approval of the Sun, that is, of the office of the High Priest, and so on. Many of his arguments were undoubtedly valid, and there was, looking at it from a political point of view, everything to be said for the marriage. But unfortunately it is difficult to play the game of politics with the persons of young and lovely queens as though they were ivory effigies of themselves on a chessboard. Nyleptha's face, while Agon spouted away, was a perfect study. She smiled indeed, but beneath the smile it set like a stone, and her eyes began to flash ominously. At last he stopped, and she prepared herself to answer. Before she did so, however, Sorais leant towards her and said in a voice sufficiently loud for me to catch what she said, "Bethink thee well, my sister, ere thou dost speak, for methinks that our thrones may hang upon thy words." Nyleptha made no answer, and with a shrug and a smile Sorais leant back again and listened. "Of a truth a great honour has been done to me," she said, "that my poor hand should not only have been asked in marriage, but that Agon here should be so swift to pronounce the blessing of the sun upon my union. Methinks that in another minute he would have wed us fast, ere the bride had said her say. Nasta, I thank thee, and I will bethink me of thy words, but now as yet I have no mind for marriage. That is a cup of which none know the taste until they begin to drink it. Again I thank thee, Nasta," and she made as though she would rise. The great lord's face turned almost as black as his beard with fury, for he knew that the words amounted to a final refusal of his suit. "Thanks be to the Queen for her gracious words," he said, restraining himself with difficulty and looking anything but grateful. "My heart shall surely treasure them. And now I crave another boon, namely the royal leave to withdraw myself to my own poor cities in the north, till such time as the Queen shall say my suit nay or yea. Mayhap," he added with a sneer, "the Queen will be pleased to visit me there, and to bring with her these stranger lords," and he scowled darkly towards us. "It is but a poor country and a rough, but we are a hardy race of mountaineers, and there shall be gathered 30,000 swordsmen to shout a welcome to her." This speech, which was almost a declaration of rebellion, was received in complete silence, but Nyleptha flushed up and answered it with spirit. "Oh, surely, Nasta, I will come, and the strange lords in my train, and for every man of thy mountaineers who calls thee prince will I bring 2 from the lowlands, who call me queen, and we will see which is the staunchest breed. Till then, farewell." The trumpets blared out, the queens rose, and the great assembly broke up in murmuring confusion, and for myself I went home with a heavy heart, foreseeing civil war. After this there was quiet for a few weeks. Curtis and the Queen did not often meet, and exercised the utmost caution not to allow the true relation in which they stood to each other to leak out. But do what they would, rumours as hard to trace as a buzzing fly in a dark room, and yet quite as audible, began to hum round and round, and at last to settle on her throne. End of chapter 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 17. The Storm Breaks. And now it was that the trouble, which at first had been but a cloud as large as a man's hand, began to loom very black and big upon our horizon, namely, Sorais' preference for Sir Henry. I saw the storm drawing nearer and nearer, and so, poor fellow, did he. The affection of so lovely and highly placed a woman was not a thing that could in a general way be considered a calamity by any man, but, situated as Curtis was, it was a grievous burden to bear. To begin with, Nyleptha, though altogether charming, was, it must be admitted, of a rather jealous disposition, and was sometimes apt to visit on her lover's head her indignation at the marks of what Alphonse would have called the distinguished consideration with which her royal sister favoured him. Then the enforced secrecy of his relation to Nyleptha prevented Curtis from taking some opportunity of putting a stop, or trying to put a stop, to this false condition of affairs by telling Sorais, in a casual but confidential way, that he was going to marry her sister. A third sting in Sir Henry's honey was that he knew that Good was honestly and sincerely attached to the ominous-looking but most attractive lady of the night. Indeed, poor Bougwan was wasting himself to a shadow of his fat and jolly self about her, his face getting so thin that his eyeglass would scarcely stick in it, while she, with a sort of careless coquetry, just gave him encouragement enough to keep him going, thinking, no doubt, that he might be useful as a stalking horse. I tried to give him a hint in as delicate a way as I could, but he flew into a huff and would not listen to me, so I was determined to let ill alone for fear of making it worse. Poor Good! He really was very ludicrous in his distress, and went in for all sorts of absurdities, under the belief that he was advancing his suit. One of them was the writing, with the assistance of one of the grave and revered señors who instructed us, and who, whatever may have been the measure of his erudition, did not understand how to scan a line, of a most interminable Zuvendi love song, of which the continually recurring refrain was something about "I will kiss thee, oh yes, I will kiss thee." Now among the Zuvendi it is a common and most harmless thing for young men to serenade ladies at night, as I believe they do in the southern countries of Europe, and sing all sorts of nonsensical songs to them. The young men may or may not be serious, but no offence is meant and none is taken, even by ladies of the highest rank, who accept the whole thing as an English girl would a gracefully turned compliment. Availing himself of this custom, Good bethought him that would serenade Sorais, whose private apartments, together with those of her maidens, were exactly opposite our own, on the further side of a narrow courtyard which divided one section of the great palace from another. Accordingly, having armed himself with a native zither, on which, being an adept with the light guitar, he had easily learned to strum, he proceeded at midnight, the fashionable hour for this sort of caterwauling, to make night hideous with his amorous yells. I was fast asleep when they began, but they soon woke me up, for Good possesses a tremendous voice and has no notion of time, and I ran to my window place to see what was the matter, and there, standing in the full moonlight in the courtyard, I perceived Good, adorned with an enormous ostrich feather head-dress and a flowing silken cloak, which is the right thing to wear upon these occasions, and shouting out the abominable song which he and the old gentleman had evolved, to a jerky, jingling accompaniment. from the direction of the quarters of the maids of honour came a succession of faint sniggerings, but the apartments of Sorais herself, whom I devoutly pitied if she happened to be there, were silent as the grave. There was absolutely no end to that awful song, with its eternal "I will kiss thee", and at last neither I nor Sir Henry, whom I had summoned to enjoy the sight, could stand it any longer. So, remembering the dear old story, I put my head to the window opening and shouted, "For heaven's sake, Good, don't go on talking about it, but kiss her, and let's all go to sleep." That choked him off, and we had no more serenading. The whole thing formed a laughable incident in a tragic business. How deeply thankful we ought to be that even the most serious matters have generally a silver lining about them in the shape of a joke, if only people could see it. The sense of humour is a very valuable possession in life, and ought to be cultivated in the board schools, especially in Scotland. Well, the more Sir Henry held off, the more Sorais came on, as is not uncommon in such cases, till at last things got very queer indeed. Evidently she was, by some strange perversity of mind, quite blinded to the true state of the case, and I, for one, greatly dreaded the moment of her awakening. Sorais was a dangerous woman to be mixed up with, either with or without one's consent. At last the evil moment came, as I saw it must come. One fine day, Good having gone out hawking, Sir Henry and I were sitting quietly talking over the situation, especially with reference to Sorais, when a court messenger arrived with a written note, which we with some difficulty deciphered, and which was to the effect that the Queen Sorais commanded the attendance of the Lord Incubu in her private apartments, whither he would be conducted by the bearer. "Oh, my word!" groaned Sir Henry. "Can't you go instead, old fellow?" "Not if I know it," I said with vigour. "I had rather face a wounded elephant with a shotgun. Take care of your own business, my boy. If you will be so fascinating, you must take the consequences. I would not be in your place for an empire." "You remind me of when I was going to be flogged at school, and the other boys came to console me," he said gloomily. "What right has this Queen to command my attendance, I should like to know? I won't go." "But you must. You are one of her officers and bound to obey her, and she knows it. And after all it will soon be over." "That's just what they used to say," he said again. "I only hope she won't put a knife into me." "I believe that she is quite capable of it." And off he started very faint-heartedly, and no wonder. I sat and waited, and at the end of about 45 minutes he returned, looking a good deal worse than when he went. "Give me something to drink," he said hoarsely. I got him a cup of wine and asked what was the matter. "What is the matter? Why, if ever there was trouble, there's trouble now. You know when I left you? Well, I was shown straight into Sorais' private chamber, and a wonderful place it is, and there she sat, quite alone, upon a silken couch at the end of the room, playing gently upon that zither of hers. I stood before her, and for a while she took no notice of me, but kept on playing and singing a little, and very sweet music it was. At last she looked up and smiled. 'So thou art come,' she said. 'I thought perchance thou hadst gone about Queen Nyleptha's business. Thou art ever on her business, and I doubt not a good servant and a true. To this I merely bowed, and said I was there to receive the Queen's word. "Ah yes, I would talk with thee, but be thou seated. It wearies me to look so high." And she made room for me beside her on the couch, placing herself with her back against the end, so as to have a view of my face. "It is not meet," I said, "that I should make myself equal with the Queen." "I said be seated," was her answer, so I sat down, and she began to look at me with those dark eyes of hers. There she sat like an incarnate spirit of beauty, hardly talking at all, and when she did, very low, but all the while looking at me. There was a white flower in her black hair, and I tried to keep my eyes on it and count the petals, but it was of no use. At last, whether it was her gaze, or the perfume in her hair, or what, I do not know, but I almost felt as though I was being mesmerized. At last she roused herself. "Incubu," she said, "lovest thou power?" I replied that I supposed all men loved power of one sort or another. "Thou shalt have it," she said. "Lovest thou wealth?" I said I liked wealth for what it bought. "Thou shalt have it," she said. "And lovest thou beauty?" To this I replied that I was very fond of statuary and architecture, or something silly of that sort, at which she frowned, and there was a pause. By this time my nerves were on such a stretch that I was shaking like a leaf. I knew that something awful was going to happen, but she held me under a kind of spell, and I could not help myself. "Incubu," she said at length, "wouldst thou be a king? Listen, wouldst thou be a king? Behold, stranger, I am minded to make thee king of all Zuvendis, ay, and husband of Sorais of the Night. Nay, peace, and hear me. To no man among my people had I thus opened out my secret heart, but thou art an outlander, and therefore I speak without shame, knowing all I have to offer, and how hard it had been thee to ask. See, a crown lies at thy feet, my lord Incubu, and with that fortune a woman whom some have wished to woo. Now mayest thou answer, O my chosen, and soft shall thy words fall upon mine ears." "O Sorais," I said, "I pray thee speak not thus. You see, I had not time to pick and choose my words. For this thing cannot be. I am betrothed to thy sister Nyleptha, O Sorais, and I love her and her alone." Next moment it struck me that I had said an awful thing, and I looked up to see the results. When I spoke, Sorais' face was hidden in her hands, and as my words reached her she slowly raised it, and I shrank back dismayed. It was ashy white, and her eyes were flaming. She rose to her feet and seemed to be choking, but the awful thing was that she was so quiet about it. Once she looked at a side table on which lay a dagger, and from it to me, as though she thought of killing me, but she did not take it up. At last she spoke one word and one only: "Go." And I went, and glad enough I was to get out of it, and here I am. Give me another cup of wine, there's a good fellow, and tell me what is to be done." I shook my head, for the affair was indeed serious. As one of the poets says, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned," more especially if the woman is a queen and a Sorais, and indeed I feared the very worst, including imminent danger to ourselves. "Nyleptha had better be told of this at once," I said, "and perhaps I had better tell her. She might receive your account with suspicion." "Who is captain of the guard tonight?" I went on. "Good. Very well then, there will be no chance of her being got at. Don't look surprised. I don't think that her sister would stick at that. I suppose one must tell Good of what happened." "Oh, I don't know," said Sir Henry. "It would hurt his feelings, poor fellow. You see, he takes a lively personal interest in Sorais." "That's true, and after all perhaps there is no need to tell him. He will find out the truth soon enough. Now you mark my words. Sorais will throw in her lot with Nyleptha, who is sulking up in the north there, and there will be such a war as has not been known in Zuvendi for centuries. Look there!" and I pointed to two court messengers who were speeding away from the door of Sorais' private apartments. "Now follow me," and I ran up a stairway into an outlook tower that rose from the roof of our quarters, taking the spyglass with me, and looked out over the palace wall. The first thing we saw was one of the messengers speeding towards the temple, bearing, without any doubt, the Queen's word to the High Priest Agon. But for the other I searched in vain. Presently, however, I spied a horseman riding furiously through the northern gate of the city, and in him I recognized the other messenger. "Ah," I said, "Sorais is a woman of spirit. She is acting at once, and will strike quick and hard. You have insulted her, my boy, and the blood will flow in rivers before the stain is washed away, and yours with it, if she can get hold of you. Well, I'm off to Nyleptha. Just you stop where you are, old fellow, and try to get your nerves straight again. You'll need them all, I can tell you, unless I have observed human nature in the rough for 50 years for nothing." And off I went accordingly. I gained audience of the Queen without trouble. She was expecting Curtis, and was not best pleased to see my mahogany-coloured face instead. "Is there aught wrong with my lord, Macumazahn, that he waits not upon me? Say, is he sick?" I said that he was well enough, and then, without further ado, I plunged into my story, and told it from beginning to end. Oh, what a rage she flew into! It was a sight to see her, she looked so lovely. "How darest thou come to me with such a tale?" she cried. "It is a lie to say that my lord was making love to Sorais, my sister." "Pardon me, O Queen," I answered. "I said that Sorais was making love to thy lord." "Spin me no spider's webs of words. Is not the thing the same thing? The one giveth, the other taketh, but the gift passes, and what matters it which is the most guilty? Sorais! Oh, I hate her! Sorais is a queen, and my sister. She had not stooped so low had he not shown the way. Oh, truly hath the poet said that man is like a snake, whom to touch is poison, and whom none can hold." "The remark, O Queen, is excellent, but methinks thou hast misread the poet. Nyleptha," I went on, "thou knowest well that thy words are empty foolishness, and that this is no time for folly." "How darest thou?" she broke in, stamping her foot. "Hast my false lord sent thee to me to insult me also? Who art thou, stranger, that thou shouldest speak to me, the Queen, after this sort? How darest thou?" "Yea, I dare. Listen, the moments which thou dost waste in idle anger may well cost thee thy crown and all of us our lives. Already Sorais' horsemen go forth and call to arms. In 3 days' time Nyleptha will rouse himself and his fastnesses like a lion in the evening, and his growling will be heard throughout the north. The lady of the night, Sorais, hath a sweet voice and she will not sing in vain. Her banner will be borne from range to range and valley to valley, and warriors will spring up in its track like dust beneath a whirlwind. Half the army will echo her war cry, and in every town and hamlet of this wide land the priests will call out against the foreigner, and will preach her cause as holy. I have spoken, O Queen." Nyleptha was quite calm now. Her jealous anger had passed, and putting off the character of a lovely headstrong lady, with a rapidity and completeness that distinguished her, she put on that of a queen and a woman of business. The transformation was sudden but entire. "Thy words are very wise, Macumazahn. Forgive me my folly. Ah, what a queen I should be if only I had no heart. To be heartless, that is to conquer all. Passion is like the lightning, it is beautiful, and it links the earth to heaven, but alas, it blinds. And thou thinkest that my sister Sorais would levy war upon me. So be it. She shall not prevail against me. I too have my friends and my retainers. There are many, I say, who will shout 'Nyleptha' when my pennon runs up on peak and pinnacle, and the light of my beacon fires leaps tonight from crag to crag, bearing the message of my war. I will break her strength and scatter her armies. Eternal night shall be the portion of Sorais of the night. Give me that parchment and the ink. So. Now summon the officer in the ante-room. He is a trusty man." I did as I was bid, and the man, a veteran and quiet-looking gentleman of the guard, named Kara, entered, bowing low. "Take this parchment," said Nyleptha. "It is thy warrant, and guard every place of in and outgoing in the apartments of my sister Sorais, the Lady of the Night, and a Queen of the Zuvendi. Let none come in and none go out, or thy life shall pay the cost." The man looked startled, but he merely said, "The Queen's word be done," and departed. Then Nyleptha sent a messenger to Sir Henry, and presently he arrived, looking uncommonly uncomfortable. I thought that another outburst was about to follow, but wonderful are the ways of woman. She said not a word about Sorais and his supposed inconstancy, greeting him with a friendly nod, and stating simply that she required his advice upon high matters. All the same, there was a look in her eye, and a sort of suppressed energy in her manner towards him, that makes me think that she had not forgotten the affair, but was keeping it for a private occasion. Just after Curtis arrived, the officer returned, and reported that Sorais was gone. The bird had flown to the temple, stating that she was going, as was sometimes the custom among Zuvendi ladies of rank, to spend the night in meditation before the altar. We looked at each other significantly. The blow had fallen very soon. Then we set to work. Generals who could be trusted were summoned from their quarters, and as much of the state affairs as was thought desirable was told to each, strict injunctions being given to them to get all their available force together. The same was done with such of the more powerful lords as Nyleptha knew she could rely on, several of whom left that very day for distant parts of the country to gather up their tribesmen and retainers. Sealed orders were dispatched to the rulers of far-off cities, and some 20 messengers were sent off before nightfall, with instructions to ride early and late till they reached the distant chiefs to whom their letters were addressed. Also many spies were set to work. All the afternoon and evening we laboured, assisted by some confidential scribes. Nyleptha showing an energy and resource of mind that astonished me, and it was 8 o'clock before we got back to our quarters. Here we heard from Alphonse, who was deeply aggrieved because our non-return had spoilt his dinner, for he had turned cook again now, that Good had come back from his hawking and gone on duty. As instructions had already been given to the officer of the outer guard to double the sentries at the gate, and as we had no reason to fear any immediate danger, we did not think it worth while to hunt him up and tell him anything of what had passed, which at best was, under the peculiar circumstances of the case, one of those tasks that one prefers to postpone. So after swallowing our food we turned in to get some much needed rest. Before we did so, however, it occurred to Curtis to tell old Umslopogaas to keep a lookout in the neighbourhood of Nyleptha's private apartments. Umslopogaas was now well known about the place, and by the Queen's order allowed to pass whither he would by the guards, a permission of which he often availed himself by roaming about the palace during the still hours in a nocturnal fashion that he favoured, and which is by no means uncommon amongst black men generally. His presence in the corridors would not, therefore, be likely to excite remark. Without any comment the Zulu took up his axe and departed, and we also departed to bed. I seemed to have been asleep but a few minutes when I was awakened by a peculiar sensation of uneasiness. I felt that somebody was in the room and looking at me, and instantly sat up, to see to my surprise that it was already dawn, and that there, standing at the foot of my couch and looking peculiarly grim and gaunt in the grey light, was Umslopogaas himself. "How long hast thou been there?" I asked testily, for it is not pleasant to be aroused in such a fashion. "Mayhap the half of an hour, Macumazahn. I have word for thee." "Speak on," I said, now wide enough awake. "As I was bid, I went last night to the place of the White Queen, and hid myself behind a pillar in the second anteroom, beyond which is the sleeping place of the Queen. Bougwan (Good) was in the first anteroom alone, and outside the curtain of that room was a sentry, but I had a mind to see if I could pass in unseen, and I did, gliding behind them both. There I waited for many hours, when suddenly I perceived a dark figure coming secretly towards me. It was the figure of a woman, and in her hand she held a dagger. Behind that figure crept another unseen by the woman. It was Bougwan following in her tracks. His shoes were off, and for so fat a man he followed very well. The woman passed me, and the starlight shone upon her face. Who was it? I asked impatiently. The face was the face of the Lady of the Night, and of a truth she is well named. I waited, and Bougwan passed me also. Then I followed. So we went slowly and without a sound up the long chamber. First the woman, then Bougwan, and then I. And the woman saw not Bougwan, and Bougwan saw not me. At last the Lady of the Night came to the curtains that shut off the sleeping place of the White Queen, and put out her left hand to part them. She passed through, and so did Bougwan, and so did I. At the far end of the room is the bed of the Queen, and on it she lay very fast asleep. I could hear her breathe, and see one white arm lying on the coverlid like a streak of snow on the dry grass. The Lady of the Night doubled herself thus, and with the long knife lifted crept towards the bed. So straight did she gaze thereat that she never thought to look behind her. When she was quite close, Bougwan touched her on the arm, and she caught her breath and turned, and I saw the knife flash and heard it strike. Well was it for Bougwan that he had the skin of iron on him, or he had been pierced. Then for the first time he saw who the woman was, and without a word he fell back astonished and unable to speak. She too was astonished and spoke not, but suddenly she laid her finger on her lips, thus, and walked towards and through the curtain, and with her went Bougwan. So close did she pass to me that her dress touched me, and I was nigh to slaying her as she went. In the first outer room she spoke to Bougwan in a whisper, and clasping her hands thus, she pleaded with him, but what she said I know not. And so they passed on to the second outer room, she pleading, and he shaking his head and saying nay, nay, nay. And it seemed to me that he was about to call the guard, when she stopped talking and looked at him with great eyes, and I saw that he was bewitched by her beauty. Then she stretched out her hand and he kissed it, whereon I gathered myself together to advance and take her, seeing that now had Bougwan become a woman and no longer knew the good from the evil, when behold, she was gone. "Gone!" I ejaculated. "Ay, gone!" And there stood Bougwan staring at the wall like one asleep. And presently he went too, and I waited a while and came away also. "Art thou sure, Umslopogaas," said I, "that thou hast not been a dreamer this night?" In reply he opened his left hand and produced about 3 inches of a blade of a dagger of the finest steel. "If I be, Macumazahn, behold what the dream left with me." The knife broke upon Bougwan's bosom, and as I passed I picked this up in the sleeping place of the White Queen. End of chapter 17. LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 18. War. Red War. Telling Umslopogaas to wait, I tumbled into my clothes and went off with him to Sir Henry's room, where the Zulu repeated his story word for word. It was a sight to watch Curtis' face as he heard it. "Great heavens!" he said. "Here have I been sleeping away while Nyleptha was nearly murdered, and all through me too. What a fiend that Sorais must be! It would have served her well if Umslopogaas had cut her down in the act." "Ay," said the Zulu, "fear not, I should have slain her ere she struck. I was but waiting the moment." I said nothing, but I could not help thinking that many a thousand doomed lives would have been saved if he had meted out to Sorais the fate she meant for her sister, and as the issue proved, I was right. After he had told his tale, Umslopogaas went off unconcernedly to get his morning meal, and Sir Henry and I fell to talking. At first he was very bitter against Good, who, he said, was no longer to be trusted, having designedly allowed Sorais to escape by some secret stair, when it was his duty to have handed her over to justice. Indeed, he spoke in the most unmeasured terms on the matter. I let him run on a while, reflecting to myself how easy we find it to be hard on the weakness of others, and how tender we are to our own. "Really, my dear fellow," I said at length, "one would never think, to hear you talk, that you were the man who had an interview with this same lady yesterday, and found it rather difficult to resist her fascinations, notwithstanding your ties to one of the loveliest and most loving women in the world. Now suppose it was Nyleptha who had tried to murder Sorais, and you had caught her, and she had pleaded with you. Would you have been so very eager to hand her over to an open shame and to death by fire? Just look at the matter through Good's eyeglass for a minute before you denounce an old friend as a scoundrel." He listened to this jobation submissively, and then frankly acknowledged that he had spoken hardly. It is one of the best points in Sir Henry's character that he is always ready to admit it when he is in the wrong. But though I spoke up thus for Good, I was not blind to the fact that, however natural his behaviour might be, it was obvious that he was being involved in a very awkward and disgraceful complication. A foul and wicked murder had been attempted, and he had let the murderess escape, and thereby, among other things, allowed her to gain a complete ascendancy over himself. In fact, he was in a fair way to become her tool, and no more dreadful fate can befall a man than to become the tool of an unscrupulous woman, or indeed of any woman. There is but one end to it: when he is broken, or has served her purpose, he is thrown away, turned out on the world to hunt for his lost self-respect. Whilst I was pondering thus, and wondering what was to be done, for the whole subject was a thorny one, I suddenly heard a great clamour in the courtyard outside, and distinguished the voice of Umslopogaas and Alphonse, the former cursing furiously, and the latter yelling in terror. Hurrying out to see what was the matter, I was met by a ludicrous sight. The little Frenchman was running up the courtyard at an extraordinary speed, and after him sped Umslopogaas like a great greyhound. Just as I came out, he caught him, and lifting him right off his legs, carried him some paces to a beautiful but very dense flowering shrub, which bore a flower not unlike the gardenia, but was covered with short thorns. Next, despite his howls and struggles, he with one mighty thrust plunged poor Alphonse head first into the bush, so that nothing but the calves of his legs and heels remained in evidence. Then, satisfied with what he had done, the Zulu folded his arms and stood grimly contemplating the Frenchman's kicks and listening to his yells, which were awful. "What art thou doing?" I said, running up. "Wouldst thou kill the man? Pull him out of the bush." With a savage grunt he obeyed, seizing the wretched Alphonse by the ankle, and with a jerk that must have nearly dislocated it, tearing him out of the heart of the shrub. Never did I see such a sight as he presented, his clothes half torn off his back, and bleeding as he was in every direction from the sharp thorns. There he lay and yelled and rolled, and there was no getting anything out of him. At last, however, he got up, and, ensconcing himself behind me, cursed old Umslopogaas by every saint in the calendar, vowing by the blood of his heroic grandfather that he would poison him and have his revenge. At last I got to the truth of the matter. It appeared that Alphonse habitually cooked Umslopogaas's porridge, which the latter ate for breakfast in the corner of the courtyard, just as he would have done at home in Zululand, from a gourd and with a wooden spoon. Now Umslopogaas had, like many Zulus, a great horror of fish, which he considered a species of water snake. So Alphonse, who was as fond of playing tricks as a monkey, and who was also a consummate cook, determined to make him eat some. Accordingly he grated up a quantity of white fish very finely, and mixed it with the Zulu's porridge, who swallowed it nearly all down in ignorance of what he was eating. But unfortunately for Alphonse, He could not restrain his joy at this sight, and came capering and peering around, till at last Umslopogaas, who was very clever in his way, suspected something, and after a careful examination of the remains of his porridge, discovered the buffalo heifer's trick, and in revenge served him as I have said. Indeed, the little man was fortunate not to get a broken neck for his pains, for as one would have thought, he might have learnt from the episode of his display of axemanship that le Monsieur Noir was an ill person to play practical jokes upon. This incident was unimportant enough in itself, but I narrate it because it led to serious consequences. As soon as he had staunched the bleeding from his scratches and washed himself, Alphonse went off, still cursing, to recover his temper, a process which I knew from experience would take a very long time. When he had gone, I gave Umslopogaas a jobation and told him that I was ashamed of his behaviour. "Ah, well, Macumazahn," he said, "you must be gentle with me, for here is not my place. I am weary of it, weary to death of eating and drinking, of sleeping and giving in marriage. I love not this soft life in stone houses that take the heart out of a man and turn his strength to water and his flesh to fat. I love not the white robes and the delicate women, the blowing of trumpets and the flying of hawks. When we fought the Masai at the kraal yonder, then life was worth the living. But here is never a blow struck in anger, and I begin to think I shall go the way of my fathers and live in Kosikas no more." And he held up the axe and gazed at it in sorrow. "Ah," I said, "that is thy complaint, is it? Thou hast the blood sickness, hast thou? And the woodpecker wants a tree. And at thy age, too. Shame on thee, Umslopogaas." "Ay, Macumazahn, mine is a red trade, yet it is better and more honest than some. Better is it to slay a man in fair fight than to suck out his heart's blood in buying and selling and usury after your white fashion. Many a man have I slain, yet is there never a one that I should fear to look in the face again. Ay, many are there who once were friends, and whom I should be right glad to snuff with. But there, thou hast thy ways and I mine, each to his own people and his own place. The high veldt ox will die in the fat bush country, and so it is with me, Macumazahn. I am rough, I know it, and when my blood is warm I know not what to do, but yet wilt thou be sorry when the night swallows me, and I am utterly lost in blackness. For in thy heart thou lovest me, my father Macumazahn the fox, though I be naught but a broken down Zulu war dog, a chief for whom there is no room in his own kraal, an outcast and a wanderer in strange places. Ay, I love thee, Macumazahn, for we have grown grey together, and there is that between us that cannot be seen, and yet is too strong for breaking." And he took his snuff-box, which was made of an old brass cartridge, from the slit in his ear where he always carried it, and handed it to me for me to help myself. I took the pinch of snuff with some emotion. It was quite true, I was much attached to the bloodthirsty old ruffian. I do not know what was the charm of his character, but it had a charm. Perhaps it was his fierce honesty and directness. Perhaps one admired his almost superhuman skill and strength, or it may have been simply that he was so absolutely unique. Frankly, with all my experience of savages, I never knew a man quite like him. He was so wise and yet such a child with it all, and though it seems laughable to say so, like the hero of the Yankee parody, He had a tender heart. Anyway, I was very fond of him, though I should never have thought of telling him so. "Ay, old wolf," I said, "thine is a strange love. Thou wouldst split me to the chin if I stood in thy path tomorrow." "Thou speakest truth, Macumazahn. That would I if it came in the way of duty, but I should love thee all the same when the blow had gone fairly home. Is there any chance of some fighting here, Macumazahn?" he went on in an insinuating voice. "Methought that what I saw last night did show that the two great queens were vexed with one another, else had the Lady of the Night not brought that dagger with her." I agreed with him that it showed that more or less pique and irritation existed between the ladies, and told him how things stood, and that they were quarrelling over Incubu. "Ah, is it so?" he exclaimed, springing up in delight. "Then will there be war as surely as the rivers rise in the rains, war to the end. Women love the last blow as well as the last word, and when they fight for love they are pitiless as a wounded buffalo. See thou, Macumazahn, a woman will swim through blood to her desire and think naught of it. With these eyes have I seen it once, and twice also. Ah, Macumazahn, we shall see this fine place of houses burning yet, and hear the battle cries come ringing up the street. After all, I have not wandered for nothing. Can this folk fight, think ye?" Just then Sir Henry joined us, and Good arrived too from another direction, looking very pale and hollow-eyed. The moment Umslopogaas saw the latter, he stopped his bloodthirsty talk and greeted him. "Ah, Bougwan," he cried, "greeting to thee, Inkoos. Thou art surely weary. Didst thou hunt too much yesterday?" Then, without waiting for an answer, he went on. "Listen, Bougwan, and I will tell thee a story. It is about a woman, therefore wilt thou hear it, is it not so? There was a man, and he had a brother, and there was a woman who loved the man's brother, and was beloved of the man. But the man's brother had a favourite wife, and loved not the woman, and he made a mock of her. Then the woman, being very cunning and fierce-hearted for revenge, took counsel with herself, and said to the man, 'I love thee, and if thou wilt make war upon thy brother, I will marry thee.' And he knew it was a lie, yet because of his great love of the woman, who was very fair, did he listen to her words and made war. And when many people had been killed, his brother sent to him, saying, 'Why slayest thou me? What hurt have I done unto thee? From my youth up have I not loved thee? When thou wast little, did I not nurture thee? And have we not gone down to war together and divided the cattle, girl by girl, ox by ox, and cow by cow? Why slayest thou me, my brother, son of my own mother?' Then the man's heart was heavy, and he knew that his path was evil, and he put aside the tempting of the woman, and ceased to make war on his brother, and lived at peace in the same kraal with him. And after a time the woman came to him and said, 'I have lost the past, I will be thy wife.' And in his heart he knew that it was a lie, and that she thought the evil thing, yet because of his love did he take her to wife. And the very night that they were wed, when the man was plunged into a deep sleep, did the woman arise and take his axe from his hand and creep into the hut of his brother and slay him in his rest. Then did she slink back like a gorged lioness, and place the thong of the red axe back upon his wrist, and go her ways. And at the dawning the people came shouting, "Lousta is slain in the night." And they came unto the hut of the man, and there he lay asleep, and by him was the red axe. Then did they remember the war, and say, "Lo, he hath of a surety slain his brother." And they would have taken and killed him, but he rose and fled swiftly, and as he fleeted by, he slew the woman. But death could not wipe out the evil she had done, and on him rested the weight of all her sin. Therefore is he an outcast, and his name a scorn among his own people, for on him and him only resteth the burden of her who betrayed. And therefore does he wander afar, without a corral and without an ox or a wife, and therefore will he die afar like a stricken buck, and his name be accursed from generation to generation, in that the people say that he slew his brother Lousta by treachery in the night time. The old Zulu paused, and I saw that he was deeply agitated by his own story. Presently he lifted his head, which he had bowed to his breast, and went on. "I was the man, Bougwan. Oh, I was that man, and now hark thou. Even as I am, so wilt thou be, a tool, a plaything, an ox of burden to carry the evil deeds of another. Listen. When thou didst creep after the Lady of the Night, I was hard upon thy track. When she struck thee with the knife in the sleeping place of the White Queen, I was there also. When thou didst let her slip away like a snake in the stones, I saw thee, and I knew that she had bewitched thee, and that a true man had abandoned the truth, and he who aforetime loved a straight path had taken a crooked way. Forgive me, my father, if my words are sharp, but out of a full heart are they spoken. See her no more, so shalt thou go down with honour to the grave, else because of the beauty of a woman that weareth as a garment of fur, shalt thou be even as I am, and perchance with more cause. I have said." Throughout this long and eloquent address Good had been perfectly silent, but when the tale began to shape itself so aptly to his own case, he coloured up, and when he learnt that what had passed between him and Sorais had been overseen, he was evidently much distressed. And now when at last he spoke, it was in a tone of humility quite foreign to him. "I must say," he said with a bitter little laugh, "that I scarcely thought that I should live to be taught my duty by a Zulu, but it just shows what we can come to. I wonder if you fellows can understand how humiliated I feel, and the bitterest part of it is that I deserve it all. Of course I should have handed Sorais over to the guard, but I could not, and that is a fact. I let her go, and I promised to say nothing, more is the shame to me. She told me that if I would side with her she would marry me and make me king of this country, but thank goodness I did find the heart to say that even to marry her I could not desert my friends. And now you can do what you like. I deserve it all. All I have to say is that I hope that you may never love a woman with all your heart and then be so sorely tempted of her." And he turned to go. "Look here, old fellow," said Sir Henry, "just stop a minute. I have a little tale to tell you too." and he went on to narrate what had taken place on the previous day between Sorais and himself. This was a finishing stroke to poor Good. It is not pleasant to any man to learn that he has been made a tool of, but when the circumstances are as peculiarly atrocious as in the present case, it is about as bitter a pill as anybody can be called on to swallow. "Do you know," he said, "I think that between you fellows have about worked a cure." And he turned and walked away, and I for one felt very sorry for him. Ah, if the moths would always carefully avoid the candle, how few burnt wings there would be. That day was a court day, when the Queens sat in the great hall and received petitions, discussed laws, money grants, and so forth, and thither we adjourned shortly afterwards. On our way we were joined by Good, who was looking exceedingly depressed. When we got into the hall, Nyleptha was already on her throne and proceeding with business as usual, surrounded by councillors, courtiers, lawyers, priests, and an unusually strong guard. It was, however, easy to see from the air of excitement and expectation on the faces of everybody present that nobody was paying much attention to ordinary affairs, the fact being that the knowledge that civil war was imminent had now got abroad. We saluted Nyleptha and took our accustomed places, and for a little while things went on as usual, when suddenly the trumpets began to call outside the palace, and from the great crowd that was gathered there in anticipation of some unusual event there rose a roar of "Sorais! Sorais!" Then came the roll of many chariot wheels, and presently the great curtains at the end of the hall were drawn wide, and through them entered the Lady of the Night herself. Nor did she come alone. Preceding her was Agon, the High Priest, arrayed in his most gorgeous vestments, and on either side were other priests. The reason for their presence was obvious. Coming with them it would have been sacrilege to attempt to detain her. Behind her were a number of the great lords, and behind them a small body of picked guards. A glance at Sorais herself was enough to show that her mission was of no peaceful kind, for in place of her gold-embroidered calf she wore a shining tunic formed of golden scales, and on her head a little golden helmet. In her hand, too, she bore a toy spear, beautifully made, and fashioned of solid silver. Up the hall she came, looking like a lioness in her conscious pride and beauty, and as she came the spectators fell back bowing and made a path for her. By the sacred stone she halted, and laying her hand on it she cried out with a loud voice to Nyleptha on the throne, "Hail, O Queen!" "All hail, my royal sister," answered Nyleptha. "Draw thou near, fear not, I give thee safe conduct." Sorais answered with a haughty look, and swept on up the hall till she stood right before the thrones. "A boon, O Queen!" she cried again. "Speak on, my sister, what is there that I can give thee who hath half our kingdom?" "Thou canst tell me a true word, me and the people of Zuvendi. Art thou, or art thou not, about to take this foreign wolf," and she pointed to Sir Henry with her toy spear, "to be a husband to thee, and share thy bed and throne?" Curtis winced at this, and turning towards Sorais said to her in a low voice, "Methinks that yesterday thou hadst other names than wolf to call me by, O Queen," and I saw her bite her lips, as, like a danger flag, the blood flamed red upon her face. As for Nyleptha, who is nothing if not original, She, seeing that the thing was out, and that there was nothing further to be gained by concealment, answered the question in a novel and effectual manner, inspired thereto, as I firmly believe, by coquetry and a desire to triumph over her rival. Up she rose, and descending from the throne, swept in all the glory of her royal grace on to where her lover stood. There she stopped, and untwined the golden snake that was wound around her arm. Then she bade him kneel, and he dropped on one knee on the marble before her, and next, taking the golden snake with both her hands, she bent the pure soft metal round his neck, and when it was fast, deliberately kissed him on the brow, and called him her dear lord. "Thou seest," she said, when the excited murmur of the spectators had died away, addressing her sister as Sir Henry rose to his feet, "I have put my collar round the wolf's neck, and behold he shall be my watchdog, and that is my answer to thee, Queen Sorais, my sister, and to those with thee. Fear not," she went on, smiling sweetly on her lover, and pointing to the golden snake she had twined round his massive throat, "if my yoke be heavy, yet it is of pure gold, and it shall not gall thee." Then, turning to the audience, she continued in a clear, proud tone, "I, Lady of the Night, lords, priests, and people here gathered together, by this sign do I take the foreigner to husband, even here in the face of you all. What, am I a queen, and yet not free to choose the man whom I will love? Then should I be lower than the meanest girl in all my provinces. Nay, he hath won my heart, and with it goes my hand, and throne, and all I have. Ay, had he been a beggar instead of a great lord, fairer and stronger than any here, and having more wisdom and knowledge of strange things, I had given him all, how much more so being what he is." And she took his hand and gazed proudly on him, and holding it, stood there boldly facing the people. And such was her sweetness, and the power and dignity of her person, and so beautiful she looked standing hand in hand there at her lover's side, so sure of him and of herself, and so ready to risk all things, and endure all things for him, that most of those who saw the sight, which I am sure no one of them will ever forget, caught the fire from her eyes and the happy colour from her blushing face, and cheered her like wild things. It was a bold stroke for her to make, and it appealed to the imagination, but human nature in Zuvendi, as elsewhere, loves that which is bold and not afraid to break a rule, and is moreover peculiarly susceptible to appeals to its poetical side. And so the people cheered till the roof rang, but Sorais of the Night stood there with downcast eyes, for she could not bear to see her sister's triumph, which robbed her of the man whom she had hoped to win, and in the awfulness of her jealous anger she trembled and turned white like an aspen in the wind. I think I have said somewhere of her that she reminded me of the sea on a calm day, having the same aspect of sleeping power about her. Well, it was all awake now, and like the face of the furious ocean, it awed and yet fascinated me. A really handsome woman in a royal rage is always a beautiful sight, but such beauty and such a rage I never saw combined before, and I can only say that the effect produced was well worthy of the two. She lifted her white face, the teeth set, and there were purple rings beneath her glowing eyes. Thrice she tried to speak, and thrice she failed, but at last her voice came, raising her silver spear, she shook it, and the light gleamed from it, and from the golden scales of her cuirass. "And thinkest thou, Nyleptha," she said in notes which pealed through the great hall like a clarion, "thinkest thou that I, Sorais, a queen of the Zuvendi, will brook that this base outlander shall sit upon my father's throne, and rear up half-breeds to fill the place of the great house of the stairway? Never, never, while there is life in my bosom and a man to follow me and a spear to strike with. Who is on my side? Who? Now hand thou over this foreign wolf, and those who came thither to pray with him to the doom of fire, for have they not committed the deadly sin against the sun? Or, Nyleptha, I give thee war, red war. Ay, I say to thee that the path of thy passion shall be marked out by the blazing of thy towns, and watered with the blood of those who cleave to thee. On thy head rests the burden of the deed, and in thy ears ring the groans of the dying, and the cries of the widows, and those who are left fatherless for ever and ever. I tell thee I will tear thee, Nyleptha, the White Queen, from thy throne, and that thou shalt be hurled, ay, hurled even from the topmost stair of the great way to the foot thereof, in that thou hast covered the name of the house of him who built it with black shame. And I tell ye strangers, all save Bougwan, whom because thou didst do me a service I will save alive, if thou wilt leave these men and follow me." Here poor Good shook his head vigorously and ejaculated, "Can't be done," in English. "That I will wrap you in sheets of gold and hang you yet alive in chains from the 4 golden trumpets of the 4 angels that fly east and west and north and south from the giddiest pinnacles of the temple, so that ye may be a token and a warning to the land. And as for thee, Incubu, thou shalt die in yet another fashion that I will not tell thee now." She ceased, panting for breath, for her passion shook her like a storm, and a murmur, partly of horror and partly of admiration, ran through the hall. Then Nyleptha answered calmly and with dignity, "Ill would it become my place and dignity, O sister, so to speak as thou hast spoken, and so to threat as thou hast threatened. Yet if thou wilt make war, then I will strive to bear up against thee, for if my hand seems soft, yet shalt thou find it of iron when it grips thine armies by the throat. Sorais, I fear thee not. I weep for that which thou wilt bring upon our people and on thyself, but for myself I say, I fear thee not. Yet thou, whom but yesterday didst strive to win my lover and my lord from me, whom today thou dost call a foreign wolf to be thy lover and thy lord," here there was an immense sensation in the hall, "thou who but last night, as I have learnt but since thou didst enter here, didst creep like a snake into my sleeping place, ay, even by a secret way, and wouldst have foully murdered me, thy sister, as I lay asleep." "It is false! It is false!" rang out Agon's and a score of other voices. "It is not false," said I, producing the broken point of the dagger and holding it up. "Where is the haft from which this flew, O Sorais?" "It is not false," cried Good, determined at last to act like a loyal man. "I took the Lady of the Night by the White Queen's bed, and on my breast the dagger broke." "Who is on my side?" cried Sorais, shaking her silver spear, for she saw that public sympathy was turning against her. "What, Bougwan, thou comest not?" she said, addressing Good, who was standing close to her, in a low concentrated voice. "Thou pale-souled fool, for a reward thou shalt eat out thy heart with love of me and not be satisfied, and thou mightest have been my husband and a king. At least I hold thee in chains that cannot be broken." "War! War! War!" she cried. "Here with my hand upon the sacred stone that shall endure, so runs the prophecy, till the Zuvendi set their necks beneath an alien yoke, I declare war to the end. Who follows Sorais of the night to victory and honour?" Instantly the whole concourse began to break up in indescribable confusion. Many present hastened to throw in their lot with the Lady of the Night, but some came from her following to us. Amongst the former was an under-officer of Nyleptha's own guard, who suddenly turned and made a run for the doorway through which Sorais' people were already passing. Umslopogaas, who was present and had taken the whole scene in, seeing with admirable presence of mind that if this soldier got away others would follow his example, seized the man, who drew his sword and struck at him. Thereon the Zulu sprang back with a wild shout, and avoiding the sword cuts, began to peck at his foe with his terrible axe, till in a few seconds the man's fate overtook him, and he fell with a clash heavily and quite dead upon the marble floor. This was the first blood spilt in the war. "Shut the gates!" I shouted, thinking that we might perhaps catch Sorais so, and not being troubled with the idea of committing sacrilege. But the order came too late. Her guards were already passing through them, and in another minute the streets echoed with the furious galloping of horses and the rolling of her chariots. So, drawing half the people after her, Sorais was soon passing like a whirlwind through the frowning city on her road to her headquarters at M'Arstuna, a fortress situated 130 miles to the north of Milosis. And after that the city was alive with the endless tramp of regiments and preparations for the gathering war, and old Umslopogaas once more began to sit in the sunshine and go through a show of sharpening Inkosi kaas's razor edge. End of chapter 18.